All right, let's move on to some other issues now. In his first real commentary since Scott Morrison won the election, most thought he would lose. Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull was out today in the media, taking aim at the coalition over its climate policies. Mr Turnbull claims it's the Morrison government that's causing higher power bills and increases in carbon emissions by not doing enough on climate policy. He was also at pains to point out that by his own assessment, he led a progressive and reforming government, and noted that his biggest regret as Prime Minister was not launching a new energy policy. Joining me now to discuss this intervention and today's headlines more broadly is Dr Jennifer Oriel, columnist at the Australian newspaper. Jennifer, thanks for your company tonight. I have to say, I thought Mr Turnbull's comments about his greatest regret as PM, not launching or getting through a new energy policy, was interesting, given it was Turnbull himself, if you remember, in the week of the coup or the spill, who scrapped his own national energy guarantee. Now, I reckon it was flawed. A lot of his colleagues felt that way too, but he ended his own policy, so it's a big regret, I suspect.
Yes, I mean, I remember writing. We were all aflutter back then when we heard that there was going to be a challenge to Turnbull's leadership, and there have been rumours about it for a long time. But I spoke with people on the weekend before he was rolled, and was so sure that it was going to happen that I wrote a column on it last Monday. And I look back on it today after reading his column in the article in The Australian, and the leadership challenge was brought about for the same reasons that it was brought about when the Liberals were in opposition and Turnbull was leading them, namely that he was proposing an approach to energy policy that was so obviously against Liberal principles he couldn't be defended. And by that I mean he was proposing big state intervention. He was proposing to create a false market where energy and renewables companies were given financial incentives and subsidies that weren't afforded to other types of energy companies. He was creating false competition, and really importantly, he was tying us through the Paris target and in the National Energy Guarantee to the kinds of targets we simply couldn't afford as a nation, and that were utterly irrational given that Australia produces only 1.3% of global emissions. So the leadership spill came about because the Turnbull government would not decouple Australia's national energy plan from targets that were very punitive to Australia, but supported by favoured institutions of Turnbull like the United Nations. And I note that the firm he's now working for is also coupled to the United Nations and promotes big renewable energy plans and investments. So I think we're seeing a long-term pattern with Turnbull where he ignored the national interest on energy. He created a false market, which we're now paying for very dearly in exorbitant energy costs, and he would not back up Liberal concerns, and they were fairly broad concerns, that he was promoting big government interventions at the expense of the Australian people. The one thing that really irritated me in his commentary today was him going at the Morrison government for not promoting a scientific approach to climate change, and that is an utterly misleading fabrication that you find on the ABC and so forth. One of the very good things about Morrison's approach, and I wrote it down here, is that he's followed the scientific advice that the weight of plastics in our oceans will exceed the weight of fish in about 30 years' time. So the kinds of things Morrison's doing are very grassroots. He's bringing the global, local. He wants to combat plastic pollution in the ocean. He wants to tackle over-exploitation of our fisheries and fisheries in the surrounding waters. And he's really looking at making things like recycling products a commercially viable energy while exceeding the Paris target. So I really don't understand the basis for Turnbull's criticism. It seems utterly hollow to me.
Well, it's also the same targets that Malcolm Turnbull himself signed in Paris, the same 26 to 28 percentage terms. The government says it's on track. Angus Taylor, the Energy Minister, came back and really had a swipe at Malcolm Turnbull. But I thought his comments that went further about the philosophy of the Liberal Party, claims that it's no longer the party it was under Menzies, suggestions, I think he even said, as a Conservative himself, and on he went about philosophy. and his pride at leading a reformist progressive government. I think those are the things that really divorce him from the grassroots of the party, those sorts of comments, because his track record pretty much right across the board during his time in public life, and I go back to 2009 when I worked for him and he was opposition leader, right across the board has really been to prosecute policies that are more left-wing than they are centre-right. And that's, I think, his enduring legacy.
Yes, he's a centrist in the traditional sense of the word. Arthur Schlesinger wrote about the politics of centrism mid-20th century. And what they are is they're internationalist or cosmopolite in outlook, so big foreign policy agendas, big interventionist agendas for foreign policy. They tend not to be patriotic, and they tend to support progressivist positions on social policy, like gay marriage and that sort of thing. So Turnbull is not a conservative by any means, and it's simply a falsehood for him to claim that legacy. And we know that when he was in office, that he was very hostile to Conservatives. He split the broad church. He left it very divided, and the three really loose factions of the Liberal coalition, which is the Liberal left, Liberal moderates and Liberal conservatives, were at each other's throats at the end of Turnbull's prime ministership, and it's taken Morrison to bring those divided parts of the party together and restore faith in the broad church that Howard left as his legacy also. So Turnbull was an incredibly damaging prime minister in a lot of ways. The only way that he was really coming around to a more conservative position, I think, was in relation to border security, and he developed a more conservative position over time. But otherwise, he was not conservative. I can't think of a single policy where he supported a conservative position.
Well, you're right to say that Scott Morrison has united those various, elements of the broad church very well, and I think that will be his enduring legacy if he can continue down that vein. I want to report a finding from the Australian Electoral Commission that's come out this afternoon too. You'll remember Oliver Yates. He was a candidate in the race for the seat of Kooyong. He garnered just over 8.5% of the vote, up against the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, who came in at 49% of the vote. After the loss, Yates took the Treasurer and Gladys Liu, who holds the seat of Chisholm, to the AEC, claiming that posters that were put up at booths providing information in Chinese to vote Liberal, and they're on the screen for you now, using what he would claim AEC colours were deceptive and misleading and all sorts of things. Well, the AEC found against Oliver Yates, so that's not such a surprising decision, but he's also, and others, pursuing the Treasurer over Section 44 claims about his Jewish background. So this is pretty unedifying, Jennifer.
Yeah, we have this situation now where independents who are sore losers are trying to make a name for themselves by undertaking legal actions or criticising governments from the rear view, from the back seat. I mean, the AEC, the case was ridiculous. Some might call it lawfare, but to claim that those signs were mimicking the AEC because they're in purple and white is nonsensical. I mean, isn't Cadbury purple and white? Isn't there a chocolate company that's purple and white? Look behind me, the Festival Theatre has purple and white lights. I mean, it's just ludicrous to make that claim. But we do see that a lot of those independents who tended to be green left and promote green left policies are now trying to attack the government from behind. They have no legitimacy, they have no moral authority, and they'd be better off trying to do something constructive for Australia rather than holding up lawfare suits or lawfare-style suits against legitimately elected politicians.
I mentioned this at the outset. ABC Chairman Ida Buttrose has made some comments that they're a bit too sensitive at the ABC, a bit too politically correct, my interpretation, sensitive is hers. But she also went further on the other side and said they're too white too, and she's open to quotas for more Asians to work at the ABC, more people of a Middle Eastern background, which I find is pretty extraordinary. But earlier today, Sky News had an interview with Senator Connie Fierravanti-Wells. She's a Liberal senator from New South Wales, and she returned to a point that I've often felt. When SBS was established, people getting services or broadcasting messages in language, in foreign languages in Australia for newly arrived migrants was incredibly important. But obviously now with the internet, you can basically tune into any service directly from overseas without massive government taxpayer-funded support. So her argument is, well, let's listen to her argument. We'll come back to it in a moment. I've got a grab here from Connie Fierravanti-Wells.
I think the issue with the ABC is the time has come where we have to have a discussion about whether we need two public broadcasters or just one public broadcaster. Now, I'm on the record, Chris, as believing that the time has come when the ABC and SBS should be merged. And that's a serious discussion to be had, because all Australians should have one public broadcaster, I believe, but the public broadcaster should produce content for all Australians.
And that's a fair point, Jennifer.
Oh, it seems eminently reasonable. The point that Aisha Buttrose is making about political correctness being a problem on the ABC has long been made about the national broadcaster. But the problem is really, if she's talking about proportional representation and issues with underrepresentation, consider the most underrepresented group at the ABC in proportional population terms, and that's the Australian people. The Australian people have voted for Liberal coalition, that is conservative or right-leaning governments since 2013, that the majority government over the life of the parliament, and yet there are no Conservatives at the ABC. There are no Conservative commentators. So if you want to talk about fair representation and improving diversity at the ABC, surely a first point of entry is to address the most underrepresented group, the Australian people. Now, there's no talk of that whatsoever, because the ABC has been and it continues to be interested in only one kind of diversity. It's the most superficial kind. It's called, I call it skin diversity. That is, change the colour of people's skins on the screen, but don't change how people think. And it is really an insult to the intelligence of the Australian people that this is the approach the ABC is proposing for greater diversity. It's an utter nonsense.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. You know, the last 9 federal elections, the left side of politics has only had a majority once. That was in 2007. They did not have a majority in 2010. They won a negotiation but didn't have a majority in the hung parliament. So 9 elections have gone the Conservative or centre-right way, and that's certainly not the representation at the ABC. I'd also take them out of Ultimo, inner city Sydney, and ensure far more suburban and regional reach, put some journalists outside the capital cities. It'd be a smart move, and I think it would better reflect Australia. We've talked a fair bit this week about Extinction Rebellion and all the anxiety, particularly after Greta Thunberg's speech in the UN, that young people are facing. But you've got to wonder where the anxiety comes if adults behave like this. And I want to play a little bit of footage from an Extinction Rebellion march in London overnight and the reaction from one parent.
I'm just a father of 2 children that's very frightened of their futures.
How old are your children?
They're 10 months and 4 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
No. I'm getting down off you. Can you see a picture? Those are the picture of your children?
Yeah.
All right, I'm okay with men showing emotion, but literally lying on the streets of London, having stopped ordinary people getting around their business, crying over climate change, what hope have those kids got growing up to have some level of perspective?
Well, I think parents haven't really been brought to task over what's happening with turning kids into activists and really exploiting them for political ends. And the climate change movement is now doing that in unacceptably high, at an unacceptably high rate. I mean, I don't know that guy, I don't know if they were crocodile tears or whatever, but it's just bizarre to see a father in that position, and it can't help the mental health of, I would think, the mental health of his kids. But one of the things we need to keep in mind too is that these radical tactics, and they are radical, are being undertaken because they have no democratic mandate. The Australian people have voted in successive elections for the Coalition's much more moderate approach to climate change, one that balances the national interest and the economic health of Australia with climate mitigation strategies. And it's really that approach that people want to see. The reason that those people are gluing themselves to whatever and stopping traffic and lying down under cars is because they have no relationship with the democratic will of the majority. And so they have to resort to more and more extreme tactics to get attention. Eventually people will just be fed up with them and tell them to be quiet. And I think we're almost reaching peak Extinction Rebellion. And people are really saying, you know, stop holding up our cities for a noisy minority that has no democratic mandate.
Well, look, you're absolutely right. They reject, they're quite arrogant. They reject the vote of the people at the last election. I think they even go further than that. They think that most Australians who don't support their cause are patsies. They're angry with the way election result after election result has rejected the extremism. So I think they don't mind holding up ordinary people. They don't mind stopping inner city traffic and making life difficult because they think they're on the side of the angels and everyone else is, you know, climate degrading, you know, capitalists or something like that. Anyway, Jennifer, I'm going to leave it there, but thank you very much for your time tonight. Great analysis as always.